Hello, everybody, and welcome to the Commander Pod, your Magic the Gathering podcast for all things Commander. I'm Spencer Simpson.
And I'm Kelton Howell. Last week, if you joined us, we were talking about typal decks, which are decks built around a specific creature type. But we wanted to introduce a few other themes that you can build your deck around. Not everything has to be around a specific creature type.
Yeah, I mean, we talked about it last week again, if you tuned in. But I, for a while, thought that the only decks that were built in Commander were creature type decks. Typal decks.
Yeah, I think that's very common for newer players when they're first starting to build decks. They mostly build around a creature type they think is cool. It makes sense. It's a little bit easier to build sometimes, and it's very fun to play.
Yeah, super fun in Commander because we have access to like so many of those typal cards. But it's not the only thing you can do. So, I mean, in casual, most decks are built around some sort of theme or synergy, and creature types being one of them. But there are lots of other things you can build around, like card type, mechanic. There's a mechanic you want to build around, a strategy, or even like an artist.
Yeah, I've heard of people building really fun decks around art where they say, okay, every card has to have art that features someone wearing a hat or something like that. It makes it kind of fun.
Yeah, I feel like I've heard of people sitting in chairs decks that people have built. I don't know how you find the synergy in those, but I'm sure they're really fun to build.
But the ones that we're going to talk about today are not hats or chairs. We're going to be talking about 3 different themes to build around. And the first one is Aristocrats. Do you want to tell us what Aristocrats are?
Yes. So when I was first playing, I remember looking through EDH Rec and seeing the different themes that you could play and seeing Aristocrats and not understanding what that meant in any way. It's not very explanatory of what the archetype is, but that is because Aristocrats originates from a Pro Tour deck that used Cartel Aristocrat and Falconwrath Aristocrat as sacrifice outlets. So that's its namesake. So an Aristocrats style deck is a deck that revolves around sacrificing creatures for value.
Yeah, it mostly just cares about things dying and usually wants to have some sort of a sacrifice outlet to help your own creatures die. So in general, the strategy for these kinds of decks are building up a board state, being able to sacrifice your own creatures, and then getting value from that. And usually trying to make your opponents sacrifice their creatures as well.
Yeah, totally. So when a deck's trying to do this, they will often create a ton of creature tokens to sacrifice, because generally that's better than sacrificing your actual creatures unless they have some sort of value.
Yeah, you want something that's kind of more replaceable.
Yeah, totally. Or they'll play creatures that they want to have either die or come back with a new enter the battlefield. They have ways to recur their creatures. So like Kelton said, they're going to be sacrificing their creatures and trying to generate asymmetrical value. That's going to be a key point, I think, in a lot of these decks is, or some of these strategies, is that they're doing something that maybe helps you, or does helps you or hurts you as much as it hurts them, quote unquote. But because they're asymmetrically valuing or gaining value from it, it's going to put them ahead.
Yeah, absolutely. So these decks in particular, Aristocrats decks, they're going to try and win by either draining you to death with effects like Blood Artist or Zulaport Cutthroat. These are creatures that whenever Blood Artist is 1 and a black for a 0/1 vampire. Whenever Blood Artist or another creature dies, target player loses 1 life and you gain a life. This is one of the best ones because it just cares about any creature. Zulaport Cutthroat is 1 and a black for a 1/1 human rogue ally that whenever it or another creature you control dies, each opponent loses 1 life and you gain a life. So it's a little bit more narrow, but these are generally the kinds of effects that these decks are going to use to win, where they are repeatedly or frequently sacrificing creatures in order to drain everybody at the table and bring life totals down.
Yeah. And the other thing they might be doing, which I think is the meaner strategy, is to play things like Grave Pact to make sure that none of your creatures stay on board. So Grave Pact is 1 black, 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 so pretty mana intensive, for an enchantment that says whenever a creature you control dies, each other player sacrifices a creature. So again, their goal is to sacrifice their own creatures to gain value, and in the course of doing that, they're going to make you sacrifice your creatures as well.
This kind of a deck can be really mean to play against. So if you are thinking about building this kind of a deck, you should probably talk with your play group first to make sure that everyone's going to be cool with that kind of a strategy in the pod.
Yeah, especially on there's 2 enchantment effects that do this. Grave Pact and Dictate of Erebos is the same thing, but for 5 mana with flash. And I think especially the enchantments are pretty mean because they're much harder to interact with, I think, in most lower power pods.
Yeah, enchantment removal is not quite as rampant as creature removal.
Yeah, exactly. So one that does this, that has the same effect, is Butcher of Malakir. It's 5 black for a vampire warrior 5/4. It's flying, and it has the same effect. Whenever it or another creature you control dies, each opponent sacrifices a creature. This one, I feel like, I mean, it's like 30 cents or something.
Yeah.
It's pretty accessible, and I have seen it in a lot of lower power or pre-con decks, and I think it is because it is a creature. So, again, talk with your playgroup. This is probably the nicer of any of those to include. I have played a game recently where I played Grave Pact and was sacrificing 3 creatures, not a turn cycle, but a turn, and it just, I mean, no one could play the game, and I felt bad, and have considered taking that out of my deck because it's pretty disgusting.
Yep, definitely warrants a conversation. A few of the key cards, we want to talk about for each of these different themes, key cards that go into these decks, so things that you can look out for or that you might want to take a look at if you're looking to build the deck yourself. So we've split these into some categories. For Aristocrats, the key cards fall into several categories, the first one being sacrifice outlets. So these are the cards in your deck that are going to let you sacrifice those creatures freely. The first one on the list is one that we have talked about before on the podcast. We love this card. It's Braid's Arisen Nightmare. This is 1 black for a 3/3 Nightmare legendary creature. So this can be your commander if you want. At the beginning of your end step, you may sacrifice an artifact, creature, enchantment, land, or planeswalker. If you do, each opponent may sacrifice a permanent that shares a card type with it. For each opponent who doesn't, that player loses 2 life, and you draw a card.
Yeah, so baseline, you play this, you sacrifice it to itself, and everyone else sacrifices a creature, which is, pretty good value.
That's a Plaguecrafter.
Yeah, it's a Plaguecrafter, right? This is basically Plaguecrafter with upside, because if they don't have a creature to sacrifice, you're drawing 3 cards, and each opponent is losing 3 life. For 3 mana.
2 life.
But 2 life, yeah. Sorry.
Yeah, and a lot of times at 3 mana, you can play this early enough in the game where your opponents may not have creatures to sacrifice, or the creatures they do have are things like mana dorks that they don't want to sacrifice and put themselves behind on mana. So this is at worst it's a Plaguecrafter. At best, it's just like a strictly better draw a card like Night's Whisper. It's just a great card.
Yeah, I mean, we've talked about this belongs in decks that aren't focused around an Aristocrat strategy, and even more so in decks that are focused around an Aristocrat strategy, because you're going to have things that you want to sacrifice. So even, like Kelson was saying, this sacrificing itself is good, but ideally you have something else that you want to sacrifice that this will hit, so that you can do this repeatably. The next one on this list is going to be Viscera Seer. This one is pretty prolific. This has been in Sacrifice and Aristocrats decks for a really long time. It is 1 black for a 1/1 creature, vampire wizard. And it has Sacrifice a creature, scry 1. The important thing to note here is there's no sort of tap. There's no at sorcery speed. It's the cost to activate the ability to scry is sacrifice a creature, and that type of instant speed sacrificing is, I think, what makes Aristocrats decks really fun and interactive.
Yeah, that makes this one of the premier sacrifice outlets for Aristocrats decks for sure.
Yeah, absolutely. And the scry 1 is not nothing, right? Even if this just said sacrifice a creature, do nothing, you would want this in your...
People would still play this card. I forget that I scry 1 off of this all the time because I'm mostly just looking at it for the sacrifice outlet.
Yeah, totally. And then the last one here, I think, may not be better than Braids, but I think is my favorite in this list, is Ashnod's Altar. This is a pretty well-known one. Ashnod's Altar is 3 mana for an artifact that says, again, sacrifice a creature, add 2 mana. Colorless mana.
Yeah, this is good. A lot of these cards that we're talking about in Aristocrats, you'll see them pop up as kind of combo pieces. They're pieces that allow you to sacrifice something for free, get some kind of value, and then be able to repeatedly do that in some way. But even without an infinite combo, Ashnod's Altar is just so good. It's turning all of your tokens or creatures or whatever you have to sacrifice, turns them into like one use soul rings. It's just ramping you so quickly, and it really gives you an opportunity to have some very explosive turns.
Yeah, totally. I mean, typically, Aristocrats decks are playing things like that create a bunch of little tokens, 1/1s. Mm-hmm. And if I can sacrifice 2 1/1s to get a 6-mana creature out and still have other mana available, I would do that any day. Like, you're playing these expendable creatures, and I just think it's a really powerful acceleration engine. We've talked about this before, potentially not counting as ramp, but I do think, because it's not permanent and you have to sacrifice stuff to get it, it's more of like a ritual, and it turns each of your creatures into a ritual.
Yep. But in Aristocrats decks, it kind of is ramp because you're going to have the fodder to feed to it. So it is repeatable. And that, so it's okay in this deck. In fact, it's really great in this deck.
Yeah, absolutely. I agree.
The next category is things to sacrifice. So if you have your sacrifice outlets, you do need to have something to sacrifice. So these are generally going to be creatures that have really good enter the battlefield effects or death triggers, and so you want them coming in and out of the battlefield frequently. And the first one on the list is a classic. This is a commander staple and has come down maybe a little bit in popularity, but it's still pretty prolific. It's Solemn Simulacrum. It's 4 mana for a 2/2 golem artifact creature. And when it enters the battlefield, you may search your library for a basic land card, put that card onto the battlefield tapped, then shuffle, and then when it dies, you get to draw a card.
Yeah, I think the big thing here is that, both of them, honestly, because the colors you could be playing in, typically when you're playing Aristocrats decks, there are some that play green. I think there are a fair amount that play green, but otherwise, you're trying to find any source of ramp that you can, and so that finding a land definitely matters.
It does, and it's much better in Aristocrats decks because you usually are going to get to control both the ETB and the LTB abilities. Solemn Simulacrum feels a little bit bad when you're not playing a deck that has a way to easily get rid of the robot, because you are going to play it for 4 mana, ramp for a basic land, and then you have a 2/2. And if nobody blocks it or nobody attacks into you and it doesn't die, you're not getting that card draw. And you really need to get kind of both modes of this card for it to feel like you got some good value out of it.
Yeah, for sure. Being able to control the timing of it dying, and even be able to kill it as soon as it enters is really important. Like, I think Solemn Simulacrum into like Village Rites on the next turn. Village Rites is a 1 mana instant that says sacrifice as additional cost, sacrifice a creature, draw 2 cards. That's great. You play this on turn 4, then turn 5 you Village Rites it.
You spend
to draw
5 mana and 2 cards to ramp and draw 3 cards.
Yeah, I think that's great.
Great.
Yeah, it's really solid. So definitely one to consider in Aristocrats decks. Like we said, falling out of favor in some other decks that don't care about it as much, unless it's like a relevant type, like an artifact. The next one here is Pawn of Ulamog, which I think is kind of the hallmark for a lot of Aristocrats decks. There's been other things printed since that I think help with generating additional mana and value out of Aristocrats decks. But Pawn of Ulamog is, I think, the OG, which is 1 black, for a 2/2 creature, vampire shaman. Whenever Pawn of Ulamog or another non-token creature you control dies, you may create a 0/1 colorless Eldrazi spawn creature token. It has sacrificed this creature, add 1 colorless mana to your mana pool.
Yeah, so the reason this creature is so good is because it is going to, when your other creatures die, it's going to create another creature, which you can freely sacrifice for mana to trigger more things that care about creatures dying. This just keeps your engine going. It's so good.
Yeah, I think the fact that what it creates is a creature that creates mana is the big part of this, because there are other things like create treasures, for example.
And those tokens can sacrifice themselves. They have the ability on the creature, sacrifice this creature for free.
Yeah, I think I have underestimated this card in some of the decks that I play. That's actually quite good.
Yeah, it's pretty sweet. It's a good one. And then the next one that we want to talk about in this section was Plague Crafter. This is 2 and a black for a 3/2 human shaman. When it enters the battlefield, each player sacrifices a creature or planeswalker. Each player who can't discards a card. So they don't actually get to choose on that first one. They have to sacrifice a creature or planeswalker if they have it. And then if they don't have any creatures, you still get them. You still get them because they have to discard a card.
Yeah, what I like about this card is it doesn't whiff, right? Unless their hand is empty, and then then
but if they have no creatures on the battlefield, no planeswalkers, and their hand is empty, they're not doing okay.
Yeah, no, you're ahead at that point. I also really like that it hits planeswalkers. I think that's pretty relevant. Often, a lot of these edict effects will just hit the creatures, and anyone who's playing, I think planeswalkers, especially in casual commander, can run away with games.
Sure.
Especially if you're playing like an Aristocrats deck that's trying to keep the board typically pretty clear as well. And so if you're playing, I guess, in a mirror matchup, that's kind of crazy. But a Plaguecrafter can go a long way.
Yeah, and a lot of the ways that you're going to see this card play and similar creatures that have these effects is they often sacrifice themselves. So you're going to play Plaguecrafter, sacrifice it to itself, and it just kind of becomes 3 mana. Every player, or each of your opponents sacrifices a creature, and that's also just good. It's a good edict effect.
Yeah, for the most part, you don't care to have this 3/2, and likely you have something that cares about creatures dying, so you're happy to sacrifice it to itself for sure.
Yep.
So the next thing we want to talk about are payoffs, things that you'd be including in Aristocrats decks to actually generate value from these creatures dying.
Yeah, you don't just want creatures dying just to die. You need to be paid off for some reason, or else. I guess that's really the big difference between good Aristocrats decks and bad Aristocrats decks are the payoffs. How good are your payoffs?
Yeah, for sure. And I do want to say really quick, we haven't really mentioned this, but you've probably noticed that every card we've talked about so far is black. And that is because that most Aristocrats decks are black plus 1 or 2 other colors.
Or just black.
Or just black. Or just black.
Yep, it's very good colors for this kind of effect. So the first payoff that we're going to talk about, this is the classic. We already mentioned it. It's Blood Artist. This is the 2 mana 0/1 that whenever it or another creature dies, doesn't matter if it's your creature or an opponent's, target player loses 1 life and you gain 1 life.
Yeah, and I think what makes this so good, we talked about Zulaport Cutthroat as well, which is whenever Zulaport Cutthroat or another creature you control dies, each opponent loses 1 life and you gain 1 life.
Yep.
Which I think at face value can just seem better because you're draining each opponent for 1. What I think makes Blood Artist really good is that, first of all, it triggers off of opponent's creatures, which is super relevant because if a board wipe happens...
I was going to say board wipe.
Yeah, if a board wipe happens, you're getting value off of all their creatures dying. But also, it's that you get to choose the opponent who loses life. So you can actually focus down an opponent for each of those triggers if you need to, which I think is actually super relevant rather than just like draining the table all equally.
Yeah, are there certain, you have a couple of these kinds of Aristocrats decks. Are there certain matchups that are bad for Aristocrats decks where you may want to target an opponent that's playing that particular strategy?
Oh, that is a really good question.
Sorry, don't mean to catch you off guard here.
No,
I should have given you time to think about this question.
No, it's okay. I do think I'll hit you with the flip side, which is I think there are very good matchups for Aristocrats decks, and those are decks that are playing big stompy creatures, right?
Gotcha.
Any of these edict effects or things that are making opponents sacrifice creatures plays really well into those.
Yeah, you might be able to play, if you're playing an Aristocrats deck, 3 small creatures on your turn, and the opponent playing some big stompy deck, maybe like a dinosaur deck, is only able to play 1 big creature on their turn, and so you're going to be sacrificing at a rate that they can't keep up with.
Yeah, exactly. So if you play a Plaguecrafter into that, well, I'm going to sacrifice my token or my Plaguecrafter, and you're sacrificing your giant dinosaur that you spent your entire turn casting.
Yeah.
So, and as far as bad matchups goes, I'm sure it has a hard time against control decks. That would be my guess, or any sort of...
that would be my guess as well.
Yeah, because they're typically trying to control the board state as well and don't care about having creatures on board.
Yep.
So they're trying to generate value.
It's like a control or a combo deck, so you might want to target them without life loss.
Yeah, absolutely. Really good question. The next one on this list is less of a staple, but one that I think is really cool and people should be playing more. And it's Vat of Rebirth. This was printed in Phyrexia LB1 at Uncommon. It is 1 black for an artifact. And it says, whenever another artifact or creature you control is put into the graveyard from the battlefield, put an oil counter on Vat of Rebirth. And then you can pay 2 and a black and tap it, and then remove 4 oil counters from it as a sorcery to return target creature card from your graveyard to the battlefield. And again, it says activate only as a sorcery. I think this card is quite good in Aristocrats decks because often you're going to be able to put, if you get this down on turn 1, you're going to be able to get oil counters on it pretty quickly, and then it's just a repeatable 3 mana reanimate. You don't have to sacrifice this, which I think is the big deal here to reanimate the creatures.
Yeah, when I first read this card, it feels like it's a lot of hoops to jump through just to reanimate a creature. But in an Aristocrats deck, I don't think it's going to be hard to pull oil counters on Vat of Rebirth. Especially, I've seen it in your deck in Cherie, which is just sacrificing so many creatures repeatably that you're going to get to do this practically every turn, and then having a repeatable reanimate effect for a really key value piece for your deck is just awesome.
Yeah, I think it's really, really good, and I really do think it's underplayed, especially if you're also generating any sort of artifacts that you're sacrificing, which typically Aristocrats decks will be making some sort of treasure tokens or other type of tokens that they're sacrificing. And so the fact that it cares about artifacts as well, I think, is pretty relevant.
And this is just, it's any artifact or creature in any graveyard, right?
Oh, it is. Oh, you control is put
Oh,
into a
you
graveyard.
control. Okay.
Yep, yeah,
okay.
you
I was
control.
gonna say, so it doesn't hit opponents' treasure tokens, but it will. You do get value off of your treasure tokens.
Yes, you do. Yeah, which is again I think pretty good, and repeatable reanimator effects for that cost, I really think is not that much over the course of a longer game.
Yeah.
In a more casual pod, I don't think this maybe is as powerful as you get into higher power pods, but I think it's a force in lower power ones.
Yep. Another payoff we want to talk about is Pitiless Plunderer. Graciously, Wizards has given us 2 reprints of this card recently, which has dramatically dropped the price, though it has been pretty expensive for a while. This is another really great Pawn of Ulamog style effect, and it's used pretty heavily for combo pieces. This is 3 and a black for a 1/4 human pirate. Whenever another creature you control dies, create a treasure token. Seems pretty simple. I'm sure when they printed this back in Rivals of Ixalan at Uncommon that they didn't think that this was going to be as broken as it is.
Yeah. I mean, it's notably it doesn't say non-token, which I think a card nowadays probably would, right?
Would. Yeah. Especially at Uncommon, yes.
Especially Uncommon. Yeah, so it's any tokens that die. And I honestly, at first reading this and then reading Pawn of Ulamog, which we talked about earlier, I thought in my mental weighing of how good they are, this one obviously was way better. And it does have, I think, more combo potential. But I think it should be noted that Pawn of Ulamog creates creatures and also triggers off of itself. Pitiless Plunder does require a lot more setup, and I think generally is more of a combo piece. But it does generate a ton of value if you already have the setup required to use it as a payoff.
Yeah, and it's good to remember it as that it is frequently a combo piece, so that if you see it, you kind of might know what's up. And that's actually what we want to talk about next. The next category is cards to remove on site. So these are ones that when you see them on the battlefield in an Aristocrats deck, you can be like, oh, wait a minute, I'm not sure I really want to let you get away with that.
Yeah, absolutely. And we've talked about several of these already because they are kind of hallmarks of the archetype and the strategy. But definitely don't let these stick if you are playing against an opponent playing an Aristocrats deck. And the first one here is Grave Pact. We talked about Grave Pact already. 1 black enchantment. Whenever a creature you control dies, each opponent sacrifices a creature. Like we said, there are several effects that do this, so watch out for those as well. Watch out for the Butcher of Malakir and for the Dictate of Erebos. If you let this stick on the battlefield for any amount of time against an Aristocrats deck, you will not be able to keep any creatures on board.
Yeah, because they're going to leverage this far more asymmetrically than you are. And you're going to end up with an empty board state.
Yeah. And if you most decks care about creatures on board. If you don't care about creatures on board, by all means, let this resolve.
Yeah, let it torment the rest of your opponents.
Yeah, absolutely.
While you sit back with your control deck.
Yeah, let them deal with it. But this is definitely one that could be problematic if you're playing against them. So again, these are all cards that you should be removing with great prejudice.
Yep. The second one on the list is another one that we've already mentioned. It's Ashnod's Altar. We already talked about how good it is. We don't necessarily need to reiterate it. It's 3 mana for an artifact. You can sacrifice a creature to it to produce 2 colorless mana. These Aristocrats decks can really go off once they're gaining such a mana advantage every turn. So if you want to keep them in check, this is a good one to remove.
Yep. Don't let them have repeatable soul rings. I think that's the lesson of Ashnod's Altar. And then this last one is one we haven't talked about, but I think is probably the best sacrifice outlet in the game. It is Yawgmoth Thran Physician, which is 2 and a black for a legendary creature, human cleric at 2/4. It has protection from humans, which is typically the least relevant line of text on here.
Another thing that I frequently forget about this card.
Absolutely. And then it says, pay 1 life, sacrifice another creature, put a -1/-1 counter on up to 1 target creature, and draw a card. And then it has black, discard a card, proliferate.
Yeah, this card does so much. Also, I do want to know, it's 2 black. You're not getting away with this for 3 mana. It does cost you 4 mana. But
did I say 2? Did I say 1? Oh, yeah, I'm so sorry.
No. It's all good. It's not that big of a difference. This card is still good either way. At 3 mana or 4 mana, this card is busted. It's mostly a free sacrifice outlet. You are going to be paying 1 life, though a lot of the payoffs for these sacrifice decks are that you're going to be gaining life. So a lot of times that just cancels out. So you're just sacrificing creatures to draw cards, debuff your opponent's creatures, which you can then proliferate those -1/-1 counters and just start killing things. It's pretty good.
Yeah, it's very, very good. Every time I'm playing an Aristocrats deck and I draw Yawgmoth, I am just so excited to get that on board because it generates a lot of value.
It's really, really good. So please remove that one if you see it before it can get too crazy. Because once it's on the board, they can start activating the abilities of this creature at instant speed in response to interaction. So they're going to get some kind of value out of it if it hits the board.
Yeah, for sure. And it could block your humans for free. Don't forget that.
Yeah. Be careful if you're playing human tribal.
Yes, that's relevant.
So to round out Aristocrats, we do want to make a few recommendations on some commanders that could get you started if you're interested in building one of these kinds of decks. The first one is Teysa Karlov. This is probably the most popular commander in Aristocrats decks. This is 2 white, black for a 2/4 legendary creature, human advisor. So watch out for Yawgmoth. If a creature dying causes a triggered ability of a permanent you control to trigger, that ability triggers an additional time. It also gives creature tokens you control vigilance and lifelink.
Yeah, so this one is an Aristocrats deck that typically builds around the a tokens theme as well, right? Mm-hmm. Because a lot of the payoffs for Aristocrats will lose you life, and this is trying to gain you that life back so you can continuously drain the table and make things happen with your sacrifice effects. Notably, it is triggered abilities of permanents you control, so it's not going to double up on the activated abilities that is for sacrificing the creature.
Oh,
which
yeah.
I don't know if anyone's ever mistaking that, but I do think that is potentially relevant to point out. But it will double up on like your Blood Artist triggers or your Grave Pact triggers.
Yeah, and oh gosh, Grave Pact, that's horrible. Notably with things like Blood Artist, it can feel like it's a lot of work to get somebody from 40 life down to 0 by chipping away 1 life at a time. Mm-hmm. This just cuts that in half, right? Yep. And if you have multiple payoffs out like that, then it's just going to start stacking up very, very quickly.
Yeah, it's a very powerful effect to have, especially in your command zone. And there's a reason why it's the most popular Aristocrats commander by a wide margin. The next one here is one that I have built and I've enjoyed playing, and it introduces a really fun deck building challenge. It is Shuri Shizo's Caretaker. So it is 4 and a black for a legendary creature spirit at 2/2, and it says, whenever a creature with power 1 or less is put into your graveyard from the battlefield, you may return that card to the battlefield at the beginning of the next end step if Shuri Shizo's Caretaker is still on the battlefield.
Can I tell you how disorienting this commander is the first time you play against it? You see this thing, it's like it's a 5 mana 2/2, it's printed at uncommon. It's kind of got this wall of text that's like very narrowly pointed at creatures with power 1 or less. You think it's not going to be a big deal, and then the first time you play against this deck, it is wild with how many combinations of payoffs you get.
Yeah, it's honestly really fun to play because it does just like you play a bunch of bad creatures, really. You play a bunch of things that have 1 power, but then whenever they die, they come back as long as Shuri is around. It does fold pretty quickly to Shuri getting removed because Shuri is so expensive. And so that, I would say, is the one downside of this deck, but it is pretty fun because you get to play a bunch of little dorks and then sacrifice them for value and then get not only their death triggers, but their ETB triggers when they come back at the end step, which is really, really fun.
It's really good. And these black Aristocrats decks are just lend themselves so well to playing Reanimator sub-themes. So even if Shuri does get removed, she starts to add up in the command zone because she starts at 5 mana, but it's not too hard to get her back out of the graveyard. So
yeah, especially if you've got a vat of rebirth.
A rat of rebirth. Oh, I love it when they make little puns on cards that like refer to past cards. I hope we get a rat of rebirth.
I hope we get a rat of rebirth too. That would be really good.
The next one that we want to talk about, I don't think either of us have built this deck yet, but it seems really interesting. It's Zimone and Dina. This is one of the legendary creature pair-ups from March of the Machine. So this is black, green, blue for a 3/4 legendary creature, human dryad at Mythic. Whenever you draw your second card each turn, target opponent loses 2 life and you gain 2 life. So the life drain is actually happening on card draw. But it has the activated ability, tap, sacrifice another creature, draw a card. You may put a land card from your hand onto the battlefield tapped. If you control 8 or more lands, repeat this process once.
Yes, it is very good that this is a tap ability.
Yeah.
Because this would be absolutely broken if it was just a sacrifice ability. But even that, I think it's a different approach to an Aristocrats deck that I think is really fun. And it's in Sultai, which is really fun. So everyone play more Sultai.
That's why you liked this card. That's funny. Well, and in blue, you get access to a bunch of untap abilities. And a lot of these Aristocrats decks don't usually have access to blue. So that's kind of a fun change.
Yeah, I think it's a fun switch up. And it is like also a lands deck. Like it ramps you too, which is kind of cool. Yeah, I think it's a very interesting one if you're trying to pick up an Aristocrats deck.
Yep. So in conclusion, these Aristocrats decks are a fun archetype that lets you play very interactively. You're moving around creatures quite a bit, moving them to the graveyard and back. And you're in general just trying to sacrifice creatures for value and trying to outvalue your opponents and benefit asymmetrically from edict effects and board wipes and things of the like.
Yeah, these ones can be really fun. We've talked about in our previous podcasts about playing at instant speed, and I think that's one thing that's really fun about Aristocrats decks is that you do get to play very interactively in that when people try to remove your things, if they try to Swords to Plowshare something, exile it, then you can sacrifice it in response, so it does go to your graveyard instead, and you get some value out of it instead. I think they're really fun to play.
The next category that we want to talk about, the next deck building theme, is wheel decks. This is another one where the term may not be super understandable right from the get-go, and that's because the term wheel comes from the card Wheel of Fortune. This is a pretty famous card in Magic the Gathering. It's 2 and a red for a sorcery. Each player discards his or her hand and then draws 7 cards.
Yes, and once you know the card Wheel of Fortune, it all of a sudden becomes very self-explanatory, which is this is all about everyone discarding their hands and drawing new hands. It doesn't always turn out to be exactly that way. So the term wheel does come from Wheel of Fortune, and it means everyone discards and draws a new hand, right? Not all wheel decks end up being purely wheel, just because the amount of pure wheel effects is pretty limited. They almost turn into, well, let's all draw cards, and then, again, I'm going to asymmetrically benefit from drawing these cards.
Yeah, absolutely. So because there aren't so many wheel effects as there are things like Aristocrat payoffs, then there's usually some sub-themes to the deck, some complementary strategies that you're going to want to build around. Things like discard, self-mill, reanimator, and even some combo pieces.
Yeah, I think one that I've been really wanting to do recently is discard. I think discard's such a cool effect, and if you can benefit off people discarding cards, I think it's pretty awesome. Unfortunately, the most salty discard decks are pretty hated.
Yeah,
Turgid
they're really
being
good.
an example.
Turgid
Yes.
God of Fear we are going to talk about, and yeah, that one is pretty scary when it comes up.
Yep. Yeah, like we said, these asymmetric generate value from drawing cards. They either will ping you to death, deal damage to you while they're drawing cards, or while they're making you draw cards. Giving you the gift of drawing cards.
That's so benevolent of them.
Yeah, exactly. Thank you, my benevolent wheel player, for allowing me to draw these cards and lose so much life. Yep. Or they're just going to be utilizing those cards significantly better or faster than you are.
Yeah, there are also a few alternate win conditions in these kinds of decks to be aware of. Something like Triskaidekaphile, which has the text at the beginning of your upkeep, if you have exactly 13 cards in your hand, you win the game. Or things like, which is kind of hard to hit, but
so awesome.
It's really funny, and it feels really good if you can do it. And then the other two are Laboratory Maniac, which is a creature that has the ability, if you would draw a card while your library has no cards in it, you win the game. And Jace, Wielder of Mysteries, which is a planeswalker that has the same text.
Yeah. Yeah, and those will either win through like a combo where they combo out and they say, cool, I draw my entire deck and this is on the battlefield, so I win. Or they will try to draw through their deck manually in a more fair version of that type of deck.
Yeah, which with enough wheel effects you can do.
Yeah, absolutely, absolutely. So again, we want to talk about some key cards. We want to talk about some cards that you would want to put in your decks if you're building a wheel deck, and then some cards that you may want to watch out for when you play against them. And the first one being Windfall. Windfall is 2 and a blue for a sorcery, and it says each player discards their hand, then draws cards equal to the greatest number of cards a player discarded this way. So it basically, this one actually is quite good outside of wheel decks as well. It's a really good way.
It's just a great blue card draw spell.
Yeah, especially if you're dumping your hand, right? This is especially good. It feels way better going from 1 card in hand to 6 or 7 cards in hand than just completely replacing your hand with something new.
Or if you have an opponent that has 12 or 15 cards in hand, then it feels really good as well because you're just drawing so many cards.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. This is Wheel of Fortune basically in blue. I think Wheel of Fortune, we've talked about this. I do feel like Wheel of Fortune is better than Windfall. Depending on the situation. Yeah, I think in CDH, Wheel of Fortune, I think, is better because in CDH, you're going down to like 1 or 2 cards, and then you get to completely refill your hand. And if no one else has been casting spells, then I guess they get a new grip too, but you're hopefully getting more out of that.
And also, Wheel of Fortune is in red, which historically doesn't have so much good card draw. Wheel of Fortune is extremely expensive. I guess I should check out the price on this. So it's about $260 for the cheapest printing of this card. And that's just because it's on the reserved list. I think if it weren't on the reserved list, this card wouldn't be quite this expensive. It'd probably be in like the $10 to $20 range. Yeah. So if your deck wants this, just proxy it.
Yeah.
Yeah. If your play group is cool with it, just proxy it. But if not, or if you just want more wheel effects in your deck, there is kind of a cycle of cards where they've functionally kind of reprinted Wheel of Fortune. They're all named after it. The first one was Magus of the Wheel. So this is 2 in a red for a 3/3 human wizard. It has the activated ability 1 and a red, tap, sacrifice Magus of the Wheel. Each player discards their hand, then draws 7 cards. So there's a creature version of this. There is another sorcery version of this, 2 in a red. It's called Wheel of Misfortune. This has an absolute wall of text. I'll go ahead and read it. Each player secretly chooses a number 0 or greater. Then all players reveal those numbers simultaneously and determine the highest and lowest revealed this way. Wheel of Misfortune deals damage equal to the highest number to each player who chose that number. Each player who didn't choose the lowest number discards their hand, then draws 7 cards. So someone's going to lose life, and everyone except for one person is going to wheel.
Yeah, exactly.
Is basically what happens there. It's way more narrow than Wheel of Fortune, but it does the same thing.
Yeah, it is just like a budget Wheel of Fortune. And again, Wheel of Fortune is so expensive just because it's on the reserved list. I don't think it's so busted that anyone's going to say, well, you can't play that because it's on the reserved list. And the last one here is Wheel of Fate, which is kind of the same thing. It is a sorcery with no mana cost because it has Suspend 4 for 1 in a red. And for those, as a reminder, when you suspend a card, rather than cast it from your hand, you pay the suspend cost, which in this case is 1 and a red, and exile it with that many time counters on it. So this is suspend 4, so 4 time counters. At the beginning of your upkeep, you remove a time counter, and then when the last one is removed, you can cast without paying its mana cost. And this one says each player discards their hand and draws 7 cards. So Wheel of Fortune effect again.
Yeah, and just to note, something to remember with suspend cards is that you can cascade into them.
So cool.
You can cast them from exile without paying their mana cost, and they just get put on the stack immediately. Yeah,
their mana cost is 0, so anything that lets you cast a spell with like mana cost extra less from your hand is you can just cast them, which I think is pretty sweet.
Yep.
And the last one here is, I don't know that it goes in all wheel decks. But it is Dark Deal, which is 2 and a black for a sorcery. Each player discards all the cards in his or her hand, then draws that many cards -1.
This is super punishing for opponents who have low numbers of cards in their hand, too. Though.
Yeah, that feels pretty bad.
Yeah, to go from 3 cards to 2 cards.
Yeah, that
pretty rough.
Really hurts. And I feel like, and typically the cards you've kept in your hand are cards that you want. So
yeah,
you're losing cards you want for potentially like 2 lands or whatever. I do think this goes typically more in discard decks than in true wheel decks because often wheel decks care more about the draw part than the discard part, I feel like.
I would agree with that. But you are going to see a lot of wheel decks that also have a sub-theme of discard.
Yeah, true. Very
true.
The
next section of cards that we want to talk about are group draw cards. So not necessarily ones that wheel, but are still drawing people cards. So the first example of this is Howling Mine. It's 2 mana for an artifact. It has, at the beginning of each player's draw step, if Howling Mine is untapped, that player draws an additional card. That's so nice. What a nice card.
Yeah,
It
how
lets everyone
generous.
draw an extra card each turn.
How generous of you, O benevolent wheel player, to
Yeah.
allow me to draw one more card on my turn.
And
gonna get some of
probably
these-
take damage or lose life or something.
Yep, we're gonna get into some of these payoffs a little later, and you're gonna see why I'm a little bit cynical about drawing additional cards to the benefit of my opponents. The next one here, exact same effect, but on a creature, Kami of the Crescent Moon, blue, legendary creature spirit, 1/3 at rare. At the beginning of each player's draw step, that player draws an additional card. Same effect here.
Yep,
And then the last one is Font of Mythos. Same effect, except you draw 2 cards for a 4 mana artifact instead.
Yeah, this one's sweet. This one really accelerates the game a lot.
Yeah, especially if you're playing something like Shieldred, which is a deck that Kelton
What?
does play.
Yeah, and that is actually the first payoff that we want to talk about. Shieldred the Apocalypse is such an excellent payoff for these kinds of wheel decks. In fact, I have a wheel deck where Shieldred is the commander, and it's awesome. It is 2 black for a 4/5 legendary creature Phyrexian Praetor with Death Touch. I don't know why they gave it Death Touch. Whenever you draw a card, you gain 2 life. Whenever an opponent draws a card, they lose 2 life. You don't like drawing extra cards, Spencer?
Let me tell you, I love drawing extra cards potentially more than anyone else besides Josh Lee Kwai.
Yep.
And this feels so bad. I think one of the first times I played against this, I was playing my Verena Lich Queen deck, which I've since disassembled. We've talked about Verena before, but for those who don't know, she has a triggered ability that whenever you attack with one or more zombies, you draw that many cards and then discard that many cards and gain that much life, which typically is really good value.
It's awesome value.
But instead of gaining life and being able to sculpt your hand, you're losing life and sculpting your hand, which the deck needs that life gain because it's using the life elsewhere. So this card, even though it's your commander, this is one that I remove with great prejudice. It is pretty tough.
Yeah, it's a great payoff for these decks, though.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think the upside that people don't think about often is that you gain life too. So if this is in a deck that can play Windfall or Wheel of Fortune, you have each opponent losing 14 life and you gain 14 life.
Yeah, because these decks don't really care that much about what's on the battlefield, and so it needs that life gain because it may not be able to block very efficiently.
Yep. The next one we want to talk about here is a card that typically you see in mill decks, actually, but and has also been seeing a lot more popularity in CEDH because I don't think people really understood how powerful this card is. It is Bloodchief Ascension, which is 1 black for an enchantment at rare. At the beginning of each end step, if an opponent lost 2 or more life this turn, you may put a quest counter on Bloodchief Ascension. Can you think of a card that might make people lose life for just drawing their card for turn? Yep, Shield to the Apocalypse, that's right. Whenever a card is put into an opponent's graveyard from anywhere, if Bloodchief Ascension has 3 or more quest counters on it, you may have that player lose 2 life. If you do, you gain 2 life. I can't think of a scenario in which you wouldn't have that player lose 2 life.
Yep.
But that added control is pretty cool.
That's a May ability that is not going to come up very often.
Yeah, no, absolutely not. But notably, this card, this is played in mill decks because it talks about cards being put into graveyards from anywhere, so people are milling and trying to do damage to you as they mill cards. Notably, this is from anywhere. So if you are cracking a fetch land, you're going to lose 2 life. If you are casting an instant or sorcery, that card goes into your graveyard, you're going to lose 2 life. It just really starts to stack up so quickly that it's a really powerful card, and it got reprinted, and there's a reason it's still climbing in value.
Yeah, absolutely. That one recovered pretty quickly from the reprint.
Yeah, but I'm kicking myself for not buying that at $3.
The last one that we want to talk about in terms of payoff is the multi-format Scourge Orcish Bowmasters, potentially just one of the most broken cards that has been printed in recent Magic history. This is 1 and a black for a 1/1 Orc Archer. It has Flash when it enters the battlefield, and whenever an opponent draws a card except the first one they draw on each of their draw steps, Orcish Bowmasters deals 1 damage to any target, then amass Orcs 1.
That last clause.
Why is this good?
Yeah. Well, I think it would be good even without that last clause, right?
Yeah.
That last clause, I think, is what pushes it over the edge, especially in casual, to be really, really good.
Yep.
which is the Amass Orcs one. This gets to ping off. You can choose any target. It's not that opponent loses life. You get to do damage to their creatures, to them, to planeswalkers, and you're also creating an orc army each time they draw a card.
If you wheel on your turn, then this is going to do 22 damage and create a 22/22 orc army.
Yeah. It's crazy. It's for 2 mana.
And that 22 damage is spread as you choose. It's basically a one-sided board wipe. You just pick off all of your opponent's creatures,
or just
deal
somebody.
straight to someone's face.
Right.
Yeah.
That's pretty bad. It's very good. Proxy it in your decks if you want, depending on the power level you're playing at. It can be pretty salty. Fortunately, it's not particularly hard to remove because it is a 1/1. So
yeah, you will notice we have talked about all 3 of these payoffs as cards that are a little bit salty. So a wheel strategy can hurt some feelings at the table if you're not careful. So just make sure that your play group is cool with it and that you're listening and having conversations about it.
yeah, absolutely. It often competes on an axis that some lower powered decks aren't ready to compete at, and I think that's where it can be kind of salty. Which, speaking of salty cards, this takes us to our cards to remove on site.
Yeah, all of these have very high salt value.
Yes, the first one being Shield of the Apocalypse, which we just talked about. We've read it. We don't need to reiterate it. This card should be removed. I'm sorry, Kelton. I know it's a commander that you play.
It's my commander.
I know
Don't
you
remove
love
my
it.
commander.
I know you love it, Kelton. I'm putting up my feelings barrier so that I don't feel bad for removing your commander, and it is gone.
There's a reason I play so much protection in that deck.
Yeah. You know the ire that Shieldred draws. The next one here is potentially the saltiest commander of all time, and it is Tergrid, God of Fright.
Yeah, as someone who has this in a deck, I have to be really careful with this card, and I would never recommend building this as a commander unless your play group is real cool about it. This is 3 black for a 4/5 legendary creature god. It has menace. Once again, we keep putting keyword abilities on cards that do not need additional keyword abilities.
No.
Whenever an opponent sacrifices a non-token permanent or discards a permanent card, you may put that card from a graveyard onto the battlefield under your control. So the reason it does have a backside too, I guess I'll just read that, though I don't know that it's ever come up. 3 and a black for a legendary artifact, Tergrid's Lantern. It has the activated ability tap. Target player loses 3 life unless they sacrifice a non-land permanent or discard a card, and also the activated ability 3 and a black untap Tergrid's Lantern. We're really just worried about the front because when you wheel, it just puts all of the permanent cards from your opponent's hands onto the battlefield under your control.
You paused saying that as if you were checking to see that was actually the effect.
Yeah, I was because I played this so many times and it still just feels ridiculous.
Yeah, it is so broken. That is so absurd. Yeah, that was awesome to watch.
You get artifacts, you get creatures, you get it all.
That was so amazing to watch, and I think is really illustrative of how broken this is. Honestly, put this in your deck, play it for the backside. The backside's not bad and is pretty fun, I guess. Actually, the backside is pretty bad.
What self-control, Spencer, do you think I have that I'm going to have this card in my hand and I'm going to be like, you know what, I'm going to cast it for the backside? When do you think that's ever going to come up?
Yeah, you know what, you're right. I don't think in fact, you reading this was probably the first time I've ever read the backside of this card.
Yeah, nobody cares about the backside.
Yep, it's very good. Play it at higher power tables where people are ready to deal with it. Or just don't play it. We don't want to police you. Play whatever you want. People will be mad at you for playing this probably. So make sure you're having a conversation before you bust out Tergrid at your table.
Yep. It's the deck that I do play it in. It's not a super high power level deck, but it is like the win con. The deck is pretty dirtly and it doesn't really do much. And then I try and play this so that then I have a board state and I can try and start swinging at people.
Yeah, honestly, I feel like it's not bad in the 99. People get pretty salty about getting their stuff taken.
I think that's it more than anything, to be honest.
Yeah.
People just do not like having their own cards played against them.
Yeah, I mean, they come to a commander table to play their own cards. And so as soon as you get them and they don't, I think that can be pretty salty. But that's part of the game. It's a legitimate strategy. In the command zone, I think this is more of a menace than it's intended to be. But in the 99, if it's just like a one-off, like you're not going to be able to get repeatable value out of it, of casting it again and again and getting people to discard cards.
Yep.
I feel okay about that, especially if you're in like not in playing against precons or a super low power pod.
Yeah.
The last one here is Narset, Parter of Veils. This is one that I'd been playing a lot. Here, I'll read it to you first. Narset Part of Veils is 1 blue for a legendary planeswalker, Narset, at 5 loyalty, and it is an uncommon. Each opponent can't draw more than 1 card each turn is the static ability of this card. And then it has -2. Look at the top 4 cards of your library. You may reveal a non-creature, non-land card from among them and put them into your hand. Put the rest on the bottom of your library in a random order. Sorry, it is just 1 card. I said them, but put it into your hand.
Yeah, and this is from the cycle of War of the Spark Commanders, or Planeswalkers, where they did that at uncommon. It was the first time I think that they printed uncommon Planeswalkers, and they only have minus abilities. So eventually, it's going to get small and it's going to die. And the minus ability is pretty good on this one. I do use it whenever I play it, but that's not really the line that we care about on this card.
No, absolutely not. That first line is the one that is especially salty and backbreaking, as each opponent can't draw more than 1 card each turn. And if you've been sticking with us, we're talking about wheel decks, which means someone's going to be dropping this and then playing Wheel of Fortune or Windfall, and only they will be drawing additional cards. You will each get to draw 1.
1 card. Yep. It feels pretty backbreaking. These are the kinds of cards, like I said, I have a couple of wheel decks actually, because I really like this strategy. I think it's a lot of fun to play. Cards like this, cards like Notion Thief, these are cards that end the game but don't end the game. It locks players out of the game without actually ending it, and that's kind of sucks.
Yeah, I mean, this is, again, in a higher power pod where you're trying to win and you're controlling the board state. I think definitely put this in there. I think this could go in any really high power commander deck, and people might be a little salty about it, but they should be able to deal with this.
And it's probably good in higher power commander decks without it being a wheel deck. Like, it's just good because people are going to be wheeling, people are going to be drawing a lot of cards, and this just shuts down their draw engines, and that's good. That's a good effect to have in a high powered game.
Yeah, absolutely. It becomes a stacks piece. But in lower power games, I've played this in a game, and I was actually playing even a higher power deck. I guess I say that. We were playing kind of higher power decks at the time, and I played this and then cast a Windfall, and I think we went through like 1 turn cycle, and everyone was like, all right, I concede because this, we can't possibly. I will say I was playing my mono blue Azami Lady of Scrolls deck, which is a lot of counter spells as well, and so I think that might have added to the salt of this. But
sure. Yeah, no, it's a difficult card to play. That said, it's really good. There are decks that absolutely want this, and like we said, at higher power levels, this is a great card to include. But just listen to your group, talk with your play group, and see what kind of game you guys are all wanting to play.
Yeah, absolutely. So some commanders that you might want to play if you want to play wheel strategy, there are lots of them. I think the quintessential commander is Nekusar, the Mind Razor. Again, probably the most popular wheel commander. It is 2 and Grixis, so blue, black, red, for a legendary creature zombie wizard 2/4 at rare. And it says, at the beginning of each player's draw step, that player draws an additional card, much like all of the other effects we've been reading. And then whenever an opponent draws a card, Nekusar the Mind Razor deals 1 damage to that player. So this is kind of Shieldred and Howling Mine in one, kind of baby Shieldred.
Yeah, it is, but you also get access to blue and red, which is where most of the wheel effects are. I have a Shieldred wheel deck, but it's only in black, so it makes it a lot harder to wheel. This makes it very easy. There's a lot of wheel effects in these colors.
Yeah. No, and again, it's the reason it's very popular. Everyone's drawing 7 cards and losing 7 life each turn. You're probably trying to get those effects back somehow. Very cool deck. Neither of us have ever built it or played against it, to be honest. I don't know how this feels to play against.
I know it's a very classic commander, though.
People really very like classic.
It. The next one on the list is Niv Mizzet Perun. This is blue, 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 red, red, red for a 5/5 legendary creature dragon wizard at rare. This spell can't be countered. That's actually pretty good. That really actually good. Matters. Flying. It has flying, and whenever you draw a card, Niv Mizzet Perun deals 1 damage to any target. So, Nekusar was dealing 1 damage to that player. This one is whenever you draw a card, you get to choose which target you deal it to. And then whenever a player casts an instant or sorcery spell, you get to draw a card. That's pretty sweet.
Yeah, I don't know that Niv Mizzet is always played as a wheel deck, but it is certainly like a viable strategy within a Niv Mizzet Perun deck, right? Like, what you want to do is have people casting spells, and so you're drawing cards, and each time you're drawing cards, you're just shooting down either their creatures or their face. And
once again, these are the good wheel colors. like red and blue have the wheel cards in them, so it's very good. And there is a combo that you should watch out for in this deck that gets going pretty quick, and that's Curiosity or any of the similar effects, which is whenever the creature deals damage, you get to draw a card, and so it just infinitely loops, and you get to machine gun everybody to death.
Yeah, they had a printer error on that one, right? So it doesn't say combat before damage. Was
it a printer
No,
error? I was gonna say today that is what the card would say. But, but yeah, it is just any kind of damage, which is what makes this so crazy.
Yeah, so you can kind of just loop, and then one of the things that's cool about Niv Mizzet is we were wondering if this was an infinite loop, but fortunately it is May. The draw a card off of Curiosity, right?
Yeah, because you are going to draw that many cards.
Yeah.
So if you don't have that many cards in your library, you will deck yourself.
Yeah.
Yeah. So it is important that it's a May.
Yep.
Then the last commander is one that you think is really cool. So I'm going to let you talk about this one and tell us why it's so cool.
Yes, please. I was like, no, wait. I want to talk about this one. It's Heliod, the Radiant Dawn. This is a card printed in March of the Machine. It is the Heliod that becomes completed on the backside. So it is 2 white for a legendary enchantment creature god 4/4 at rare. When Heliod the Radiant Dawn enters the battlefield, return target enchantment card that isn't a god from your graveyard to your hand. Pretty cool. And then it has 3 and a Phyrexian blue mana, transform Heliod the Radiant Dawn. The backside is Heliod the Warped Eclipse, which is a legendary.
That's a pretty cool name.
It's pretty sweet, and the art is awesome too. So it's a legendary enchantment creature, Phyrexian god at 4/6, and it says you may cast spells as though they had flash. And here's the part that makes this a wheel deck. Spells you cast cost 1 less to cast for each card your opponents have drawn this turn.
Ooh, that's cool.
Which is so cool. So this deck will play, wheel effects. This was seen as a CDH deck for a while because there are more blue wheels. Time Twister is a blue wheel that people play. That's completely outside the budget, I think, of any deck. And probably you wouldn't want to proxy actually in your casual games because it is a little bit, I think, stronger than your Windfalls or Wheel of Fortunes. But the idea of this deck is that you want to get people to draw cards, not even necessarily a wheel, just say, hey, each of us are going to draw cards, and then you generate value off of that, which is really cool.
Yeah, so things like even cards that make your opponents draw on their turn, like Howling Mine or Font of Mythos, that you're wanting to play instant speed anyway, and so you're able to cast those spells for cheaper.
Yeah, think about it this way. If you make each opponent draw 1 card, you're discounting your spells by 3 mana, right? If each opponent draws a card, which is crazy. Sure. And the fact that you can play spells at instant speed, I think is what makes this so cool. So often it plays a lot of artifacts, which you can discount down to free, right?
Oh, cool, because
it's just opponents drawing cards. Yeah, which is really, really cool. And you can cast them at instant speed as well, which I think it makes this deck.
Whoa.
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah, I can see how the pieces are all fitting together, and it would be a pretty cool deck to
It's pretty sweet. This is one you could put Coveted Jewel in.
One of my pet cards.
Yes.
Okay, well, the last theme or archetype or strategy that we're going to talk about today is lands decks. Probably the most self-explanatory of the bunch. They just care about having or playing lands, and a lot of them.
Yeah, so these are going to be generating value by having lands enter the battlefield or be put into a graveyard, playing additional lands each turn. It's, again, pretty self-explanatory. Lands is kind of the theme of this.
That's it. So the key cards, some of the categories are cards that let you play extra lands. So these are cards like Exploration, which is an enchantment for 1 green. You may play an additional land on each of your turns. That's great. Yeah, we just want more lands.
Yep, absolutely. There's one called Oracle of Moldiah. Does the same thing. 3 and a green for a 2/2 creature elf shaman. You may play an additional land on each of your turns. Play with the top card of your library revealed. This is, I think, what makes it especially good is that you can play lands from the top of your library.
Yeah, you got to clear those off the top, which is really good. So then you're not drawing into lands.
Yeah, and so the play pattern with this one, just so everyone's aware if they're first playing this, is if you have lands in hand and you have Oracle of Moldiah on the field, check that top card first.
Yeah.
Because potentially you could hit 2 lands off the top, which is pretty cool.
And it's also not check. You just have to have it revealed. So you got to flip over the top of your library.
Oh, you just know. People
Yeah,
just know.
You got to play with it revealed. Another one in this category is Azusa Lost But Seeking. This is 2 and a green for a 1/2 legendary creature human monk. You may play 2 additional lands on each of your turns. So now we're really cooking.
Yep, very good card. Fortunately, it was reprinted. This was very expensive and a very good staple in a lot of lands decks.
Yes, it was, and it's climbing again. It got pretty cheap for a minute, but I think it's starting to climb again.
Oh no, do I need to buy one? I didn't yet. You have an extra one, right?
I do, a Spanish copy. You can have it.
Okay, sweet, thank you. Yeah, playing additional lands on your turn is really what's going to help you in lands decks, especially because a lot of it cares about lands entering the battlefield. The next thing we want to talk about, the next cards will help you find your lands. And one of those may not make sense at first is Ramanap Excavator. Ramanap Excavator is 2 and a green for a 2/3 creature Naga Cleric at rare. You may play lands from your graveyard.
Yeah, this is cool because it's going to, especially cards like Fetch Lands or Evolving Wilds, these are going to let you play those cards multiple times. And that's pretty powerful because you're thinning out your deck. You're getting selection of which lands you're going to play. And Ramanap Excavator is a card that enables you to utilize those cards that are already in your graveyard.
Yeah, I think what makes it so good too is that you may not have a land in your hand, and so you get to play the lands from your graveyard instead. But even if you do, you get to keep that land in your hand for later if Ramanap Excavator gets removed.
Yeah, you should play the lands in your graveyard first.
Yes, absolutely. The next one here is Cultivate. Cultivate. A classic. Cultivate or Kodama's Reach. 2 separate cards, the exact same effect.
Yep.
2 and a green. Sorcery. Search your library for up to two basic land cards. Reveal those cards. Put one on the battlefield tapped and the other into your hand. Then shuffle.
Yep.
And what makes
we
this
run
so
a ton
good,
of these kinds of effects in our decks.
Yeah, absolutely. And what makes it so good, this goes in every deck, but especially in landfall decks, what makes it so good is if you don't have an additional land drop on your turn and you play Cultivate, you get a land to hit the battlefield, and then you get to play the land that you got to your hand, which I think makes it especially good.
Yeah, it definitely keeps you safe from missing land drops, as does this next card, Abundance. This one's maybe a little more narrow. It's kind of expensive. It's 2 green for an enchantment. 4 mana can be a lot to pay for an enchantment that doesn't do anything when it enters the battlefield, but it does have kind of a fun effect. If you would draw a card, you may instead choose land or non-land and reveal cards from the top of your library until you reveal a card of the chosen kind. You put that card into your hand and put all the other cards revealed this way onto the bottom of your library in any order.
This card's pretty sweet. Like you said, 4 mana is a lot of mana to not get value off of immediately, but it lets you choose what you're going to draw, which is pretty crazy.
So if you have lands in hand, choose non-land. Then you're guaranteed to not draw another land card. And in lower power games, enchantment removal isn't quite as prevalent. And so even though you're spending 4 mana, hopefully you're getting that value back in subsequent turns where you're really shaping your draws and getting to choose what you want. The reason that I think this card is very fun is because it combos with Cultivator Colossus. I play this combo in one of my decks. So Cultivator Colossus will let you... I guess I should read Cultivator Colossus even though I didn't put it in our show notes here. Cultivator Colossus is 4 green for a star plant beast. It has trample. Its power and toughness are each equal to the number of lands you control. And when it enters the battlefield, you may put a land card from your hand onto the battlefield tapped. If you do, draw a card and repeat this process. So if you have abundance out when you play this, you just keep choosing land. And so you get every land out of your deck onto the battlefield. And then because you get to put the cards back in any order, you get to order the rest of your deck, which is all non-land cards.
Oh my gosh. That's
so
crazy.
It's a pretty spicy combo. It's so expensive. It's 4 green, and another 2. So it's just like you have to have so much mana available to do something like this, but it's a very fun, splashy effect.
Yeah, but you're playing lands. You're going to have that much mana.
You are going to have that much mana. That's true. Yeah.
So the next thing we want to talk about here are the payoffs for lands decks. A lot of these lands decks, admittedly, are very popular, so you'll probably have seen a lot of these cards. The first one being Avenger of Zendikar. This one feels like it comes in nearly every precon because a lot of these lands matters type effects do so well in other decks that aren't specifically lands decks because you have to play lands, right?
Yeah, and it says something that this card is still $4, even though it comes in a bunch of these precons. It's because it is a really good payoff. This card is 5 green for a 5/5 elemental at Mythic. When it enters the battlefield, you create a 0/1 green plant creature token for each land you control. And then it has the ability Landfall. We're going to see several cards that have this ability. And those trigger whenever a land enters the battlefield. And in this case, under the battlefield under your control. It's only your lands. In this case, you may put a +1/+1 counter on each plant creature you control.
Yep. So if you play this on when you have 7 mana, it hits the battlefield, you have a bunch of 0/1s, and everyone's like, oh, what's the big deal? You have 0/1s. Well, the next turn, you play Exploration and then play 2 lands, and all of a sudden, you have a bunch of 2/3s.
A bunch of 2/3s. And then on the
7
next turn,
2/3s, right?
The next turn, they're 4/5s.
Yeah.
Yeah, it gets out of control pretty fast.
It can. They get very, very big, which is really cool. And it can also fuel your Aristocrats decks if you're looking for some tokens to sacrifice.
There you go, in Golgari. I like it. The next card is Scute Swarm. This is another one that gets out of control very quickly. 2 and a green for a 1/1 insect. What's the big deal? It's a 1/1 insect. It has landfall. Whenever a land enters the battlefield under your control, you create a 1/1 green insect creature token. If you control 6 or more lands, you create a token that's a copy of Scute Swarm instead. It's so fun.
So as soon as you hit 6 lands, you're not making benign little 1/1s. You're making another Scute Swarm and doubling. It's an order of magnitude more of Scute Swarms each time.
Yeah, you double it and give it to the next land.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yep.
Yeah, you absolutely do.
Yeah, it's pretty good. This one just gets you a huge board so quickly, especially when you're playing multiple lands per turn.
Yeah, I want to do some math really quick. So 1 Scute Swarm, you play a land, you get 2 Scute Swarms.
Yep.
Then you play a land, then you get 4, and then 8. Yeah, it just doubly. That's so bad.
Yeah.
That's so crazy.
It's awesome. That's great.
The next one here is Rampaging Baloths. It is 4 green for a 6/6 creature beast with trample, and it also has landfall. Surprise, surprise. Whenever a land enters the battlefield under your control, you may create a 4/4 green beast creature token.
Yeah, so these payoffs have all had landfall, and it's just because in land sticks, you're going to be playing a lot of lands, and there's also ways to just kind of loop lands and just keep having lands enter the battlefield, and so you're just going to overwhelm people with these kinds of tokens, and that's generally what you're trying to do in this kind of a deck.
Yeah, I should be playing this. This is a good card.
It is a good card. It's also just a 6/6 trampler for 6.
Yeah, it's pretty big.
And then you get to create 4/4. So it doesn't even have to go into dedicated land stacks, and it's pretty good.
No, and 4/4s are sizable. Like,
yeah.
If it was
free,
3/3s
every turn.
Yeah, exactly. That's really, really good. Somehow that feels much worse than like 3/3s. A 4/4.
Yeah. I think 4/4 might be the point at which a creature is outpacing a lot of the kind of just like value creatures that are on the battlefield.
Yeah, agreed. So the next thing here is cards to remove on site when you're playing against a lands deck. You want to start us off, Kelton?
Yep. Scute Swarm. We just talked about it. If you see it on the battlefield, we just did the math. We showed you how it gets out of control. Remove it. Get rid of it. Don't let it stick around because they're not just going to be playing one land on their turn. Most likely, they're going to be playing multiple lands. So if this comes down on the battlefield, try and get rid of it as quickly as possible.
Yeah, it's a pretty rough one. I just barely thought about this. I don't know why I didn't. They're playing a land, and then they're playing all of their ramp spells. They're playing their cultivates. They're playing their... Yeah, that's really bad.
It's not just playing lands on your turn.
No, that gets out of control very fast. Yeah. The next one on here is Nyxbloom Ancient, which is such a cool card. I want one so badly. It needs a reprint. It is 4 green for a 5/5 enchantment creature elemental. At Mythic, it has Trample, and it says, if you tap a permanent for mana, it produces 3 times as much of that mana instead.
That's so crazy. Anything that triples just feels like, what is this card? This is a joke.
Yeah, that's a significant amount of mana. That turns oh my goodness, that's 6 mana for tapping 2 lands.
Yeah.
Don't let this thing stick, because likely they have more than 2 lands on the battlefield.
If they're playing a lands deck.
If they're playing a lands deck and big stuff to spend it on.
Yeah, absolutely. This one can get out of control as well. And then we already talked about this earlier. Azusa Lost But Seeking. Just all of these kinds of effects that are letting people play extra lands per turn is so good in land stacks just because they're getting the landfall abilities, but it's also ramping them. They're also just getting way far ahead of you on mana. And so these kinds of abilities can be really powerful to remove early in the game. So if someone plays their Azusa Lost But Seeking on turn 3, it might be a good idea to spend that removal to get rid of it.
Yeah, I mean, we've talked about in prior podcasts that you want to save your interaction for things that are actually going to make you like lose the game or going to be affecting your life total drastically. This is an instance where the way they're going to reach that point is through this creature, right? It's not a do nothing creature. This is letting them play 2 more lands each turn, which is going to put them significantly ahead.
Yep. So if you're thinking, hey, this sounds kind of fun, I think I want to build a lands deck, we've got a few recommendations on commanders that you can start with. The first one is AC, Tyrant of Gyre Strait. This is 4 green-blue for a 5/5 legendary creature Serpent. You may play an additional land on each of your turns, and whenever a land enters the battlefield under your control, you may draw a card. So not only is it giving you the payoff, it's also enabling it, and that's really good to have in the command zone.
Yep, this card is quite good. If I were to build a lands deck, this might be one that I want to build around. Kelton, you have built this deck.
I have built this deck, and it's really fun. I built it as kind of like a landfall combo deck, and that's really fun. I was lucky enough to get this as a gift in one of the pre-constructed commander decks from you, Spencer. So thank you so much. You're the reason I am able to have this deck. But if you're wanting to build this and not spend $25 on the commander, there is a card that is 16 cents that is practically the same, and it's Tatiova Benthic Druid, and it's 3 green-blue for a 3/3 legendary creature Merfolk Druid. As landfall, whenever a land enters the battlefield under your control, you gain 1 life and you draw a card. So it doesn't let you play the extra land per turn, but you are gaining a little bit of life, and it is one mana cheaper and 100 times less expensive.
Yeah, less expensive monetarily. Yep, absolutely. Don't sell yourself short, Kelton. You won this AC deck fair and square. We played a draft for Kelton's birthday, which he won, and he chose this as his prize. So
it's so suspicious when you say it was for your birthday and you won. It just makes it feel like you let me win, so I could.
That does make it feel like it's a throwaway, and it was like, oh, surprise. No, Kelton, very good limited player. He deserved that one for sure. The next one here is Omnath, Locus of Rage, or affectionately known as Angry Omnath.
We love Angry Omnath.
Yep, there are a bunch of different Omnaths. This is the one we wanted to talk about. Probably the simplest to pilot of the Omnaths. It is 3 red, green, so a lot of mana. Fortunately, you're playing a lands deck for a legendary creature elemental at 5/5 at Mythic. Whenever a land enters the battlefield under your control, create a 5/5 red and green elemental creature token.
Hey, that's better than 4/4s even.
It's even better than 4/4s. Whenever Omnath, Locus of Rage, or another elemental you control dies, Omnath deals 3 damage to any target. I forgot that it does that. That is crazy.
That's why he's Angry Omnath.
Yeah, that makes sense.
Yeah, it's this card. I've played against this, and it is a doozy. You know what's funny is I actually think I've only ever played against this card in 1v1 Commander, and it is so mean in 1v1 Commander.
Yeah, you don't have to spread out that damage at all.
Nope, it goes straight to your face, and it does not feel very good.
Yeah, this is slightly better than Rampaging Baloths. It doesn't have trample, though. That's what I'll say.
It doesn't. Nope, but it deals a whole lot of damage.
Yes, it does.
Yeah. And then the last one we wanted to recommend was the Gitrog Monster. This is 3 black-green for a 6/6 legendary creature Frog Horror at Mythic from Shadows over Innistrad. It has Death Touch. Once again, why are we putting these keyword abilities on creatures? Yeah. At the beginning of your upkeep, sacrifice the Gitrog Monster unless you sacrifice a land. You may play an additional land on each of your turns, and whenever 1 or more land cards are put into your graveyard from anywhere, draw a card.
Really cool card. This is one I've been wanting to build actually for a long time. I think it's a really cool take on a lands matter strategy because it's all about getting those lands into your graveyard, and then you play something like Ramanap, Excavator, or Crucible of Worlds to play them again.
Yeah, it's really good.
Does really good with like fetch lands and stuff. I will say, no shade to our friend that we were just playing with. He played a deck like this, and he had Azusa out and Crucible of Worlds and the Gitrog Monster, and he was looping Wasteland. Yep, Wasteland is you can tap Wasteland and sacrifice it, and you destroy target non-basic land.
Yeah, he did give the disclaimer that he built this deck a really long time ago and hadn't played it in a while and forgot that that little loop was in there, and it does make it pretty hard to play against.
It was pretty disgusting. Here's the thing, though. It is a win condition in the deck, right? But that is something to be aware of. There are very mean ways to build a deck like this, or any lands deck. Yep. But I think this is a really cool one. You can build a really cool Gitrog Monster deck.
Absolutely. Well, thank you all so much for listening. We hope that you had some fun learning about Aristocrats decks, Wheels decks, and Lands decks, and maybe one of them piqued your interest. So you might want to build a new deck in one of those strategies. Join us again next week for another new episode. You can find us on YouTube, Spotify, or wherever you get your podcasts. You can also reach out to us on thecommanderpod.com. We've got a little website. You can go there if you want to contact us.
Or in the comments.
Yeah, we love reading your comments. Tell us what decks you think you might want to build from these 3 strategies. We'd really love to hear if one of these commanders piqued your interest, or if there's another one that we didn't talk about that you think is really cool. There's a lot of good stuff going on here.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you, everybody. We have felt so much support. It's been crazy how many of you have been listening and tuning in, and it's really has made us really happy and made us want to continue doing this. So thank you very much. Until next time, remember to always pay the one.